Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Joining me as always is correspondent Mike Manier. Mike, who do we have on the show today?
Stu, today we have Eoin Madden. Eoin is a full-time advocate for the Wilderness Committee. Says it's the largest citizen-funded advocacy group for the environment in Canada. Eoin has an interesting story. He's from Ireland originally and said he saw firsthand the effects of coal and realized that climate change was something he needed to know more about. And so he actually left a very successful practice as a criminal lawyer to get a graduate degree in climate change. I didn't even know such a thing existed, but he has a graduate degree in climate change, came to British Columbia, probably one of the epicenters in the world for the discussion on climate change. He's been to the oil sands. He has a lot to say on the question of oil sands projects that are proposed in BC, but his approach is really about biodiversity, cumulative effects, which is something you hear a lot. Let's not just look at one project. We've got to look at all of these projects, including mining of minerals, coal, LNG, bitumen. All of it has to be looked at. All of it has to be looked at critically for us to make sure that we have what Eoin would call a sustainable future.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about his background because he gives a very reasoned and sensible approach to what it is that he's hoping to have happen in the midst of a debate that is piled on with emotional rhetoric.
He acknowledges what a lot of people in the resource industry saying is a key fact that gets missed from the debate. What about consumers? Consumers are the ones that are driving demand for all of these products that need to be mined and shipped from Canada and other countries around the world. Eoin acknowledges that that is a fair point, that it's a real issue, and that we can't have this discussion without also talking about consumers and the role that they have in driving the need for a resource-based economy in Canada.
A very interesting man. Let's now go to that conversation that we recorded here on September the 8th. We'll be back in a moment. You know, you're here under the topic of pipelines, which is the beginning of where I think our discussion will begin. I'm not sure that it will end there, because I can't help but think that pipelines are part of a larger continuum. They are just one part of it. Am I right about that?
Totally. First off, a guy with an Irish accent, what's he doing here? I am in the country a number of years, and I do want to be a Canadian. Pipelines for me have become the reason for us to engage in a very important conversation, and that's about climate change. It's also about the worth of our natural world, what drives sort of BC's economy. It is a much, much, much bigger conversation. I'm sad to say it has been horrendously polarized, and I'm very, very glad that you're doing this, because it helps us get away from those polar snapshot pieces and get into the real issue. For me, pipelines are an excuse to have a conversation about the biggest challenge facing humanity, and that's climate change.
It is one component, and what happens though is you get people who will focus on pipelines, you'll get people who will focus on tankers, you'll get somebody else who will focus on the extraction of oil from the oil sands or any other way in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so it's the movement of that product, it's the extraction of it. But let's talk about pipelines first of all. Do you have issues specifically about pipelines, and what are they?
Well, it's more the issue of what's in the pipeline than the pipeline itself, and that's a really key distinction. A pipeline is just a piece of metal in the ground. It causes a certain amount of deforestation, and it does cause spills. We've seen that with Kinder Morgan here in Burnaby in 2007. It's not if, but when, and there is no foolproof system. Obviously, everything we do on an energy front has an impact. It is what is in the pipelines that is a key issue. And again, I'm glad this conversation is happening, because I feel that doesn't really get out there as much. You've seen First Nations step up to the plate in relation to pipelines. A lot of them are talking about the 6 or 7 generations ahead of us and what they're going to live in and what their world is going to be like. It's as much about what's in the pipelines as the pipeline itself. It's as much about the effect of having a construction project with this, a pipeline which would spill at some point, as it is about the bitumen processed in Alberta, mixed with a diluent and sent down that pipeline and being burned into our atmosphere and causing ever-increasing amounts of damage on a climate front. 2 examples in BC, our pine beetle infestation and a loss of our shellfish industry.
Okay, let me stop you there for a second, because one of the things that I think is important in this debate is that we address, well, what would be the issues around the integrity of a pipeline per se?
Yeah.
Because so often when I get involved in this conversation, there's a touch and go on pipelines, and then it's off to climate change, or what do we do about this? We touch on something else. And it's easy to bring in all that evidence. But the pipeline itself, and this is the thing that I want to take a look at first, because, and partly because I hear people say, well, if you move oil down there, then I have a concern. But if it's natural gas, it's okay.
Yeah.
When I take a look at the evidence about ruptures in pipelines, just in British Columbia, there's far more ruptures with natural gas than there are with oil.
Yeah.
And when I look at what's happened with oil, there's a tremendous kind of recovery rate on the product that has been spilled. They don't get it all. There's absolutely no way that they can. But with natural gas, there's no recovery.
Right.
Like and so why is it that psychologically, and maybe that's the thing that we go, oh, well, it's okay for LNG or natural gas, but not okay for oil. We're talking about a pipeline.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I fully agree. In isolation, the choice, pipeline versus an LNG pipeline, or a pipeline versus oil by rail, it doesn't really encapsulate the real issues. A lot of the time I feel that the narrative, this conversation, is driven by those who message on it, industry, and those who recycle that messaging, our newspapers. But very often the conversation is narrowed on these very small, specific conversations, when the conversation is about, do we want more fossil fuels or less?
But from your perspective, you're talking to somebody who, most people live in this environment, and they kind of go, well, I like driving my car and I like having my computer. Convince me. And so isn't there value in being able to say, but here's the way that a pipeline is made. Here's how, where its weaknesses are, and be as specific as possible. So when it comes to pipelines, what is it about a pipeline that you go, this is the real concern when it comes to maintaining the integrity of the system so that we don't get that cataclysmic spill? Like, where is the weak point?
The weak point is the piece of your question, I think, where you said, we don't. And we come from the perspective that we will. It's a question of time. No amount of money seemingly spent on technology can eradicate the risk. And like the example I use is the Columbia Space Shuttle, which received billions upon billions of dollars in safety provision. NASA's best, all worked on safety, and we still had a problem, a catastrophic problem.
Twice.
A great example is the Exxon Valdez. Now, the story behind the Exxon Valdez is quite simple. The night that this Exxon Valdez got in trouble and sank, there was top-class navigation provision on that boat. Top-class radar, it cost a lot of money, well beyond what the standard was at the time, and advertised as any oil pipeline company would advertise as, going beyond where we have to go to keep this thing safe. On the night itself, that was switched off, and it was switched off because Exxon didn't want to spend the money, given market circumstances, on maintaining the machinery. The problem is that there is no, we can stop this. It's the conversation about how much risk and damage is worthwhile is correct. We should have that conversation, absolutely. But I think a lot of people in BC are coming from the perspective of, this is Enbridge. If it's the Enbridge pipeline, we've seen what happened in Kalamazoo. This is different to crude oil. That's bitumen and seems to react differently in the marine environment. The federal government followed up and said, yes, that's true. There's a large body of evidence that says that, spending on welding, you could say welding is something we should all chat about.
Which is important in pipelines.
It is absolutely important in pipelines, and I'm not avoiding that. You could talk about lasers that are breached by a spill and react increasingly. The track record is where people look. They look at market circumstances. If a technology is incredibly expensive to bring in, Who's to guarantee that it will actually be operated like we saw with Exxon? You are, if you could sort of summarize it, you're coming from a place of deep mistrust given the track record involved here.
Okay, but is that accurate? And I ask this
Yeah.
because I'm curious to know.
Yeah.
I go and I do research and I look at it and
Yeah.
it says of the billions of barrels of oil that
Yeah.
are transported back and forth
Yeah.
across North America,
Yeah.
99.999%
Yeah.
of it arrives safely at its destination. And then there are incidents like Kalamazoo where it didn't, and it was exacerbated by human error.
Yeah.
And so, but is it appropriate for us to look at that one incident and say, therefore, don't do it?
Yeah.
When we consider the demands of our modern life, and this is the thing that I think is hard to try and figure out.
Yeah, yeah. I think that when we look at the damage and potential damage from a pipeline, there are things that we absolutely do not take into account. We don't take into account what's happening upstream. We don't take into account the guaranteed absolute spill the day that that oil gets out there into the atmosphere in the shape of climate change, right? So we have to look at the broad spectrum of what these pipelines actually mean. If we, in my opinion, if we get right down to just talking about is the actual structural integrity of a pipeline safe versus other technologies, that's a very simple conversation to have.
What's your answer to that question?
You could arrive at the fact that maybe statistically oil in a pipeline is less likely to spill than on a train. They've looked at those and they've seen how much oil spills when a train crashes. It seems to be slightly less, but the train crashes happen more often. I don't deny that there is a conversation very focused on that. What I always say is that doesn't cover even half of the real issues.
This is a little bit of sidebar here.
Yeah.
Do you know that the first pipeline in North America was built to get the oil from the wellhead to the train? Because before that,
Yeah.
it used to travel by horse-drawn cart
Yeah.
in old oak whiskey barrels.
Yeah.
And that's where the term a barrel of oil came from.
Yeah.
And so they built the pipeline to make it safer to get from the oil, like the wellhead,
Yeah.
to the railroad. So railroads and the movement of oil have been around for
Yeah.
a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if I sit down with a conversation about someone about the whole spectrum of issues raised by a pipeline, and they make the point, pipelines are relatively safe, I won't fight that.
Okay.
I'll say that there are times when they spill. We can expect one to spill. I would take the eventuality of a spill and I'd say add that on to the cost of climate change,
Yeah.
and add it on to the First Nations issues with pipelines, which basically they've been isolated, I feel, politically because of it. Take the anti-democratic activities of our federal government in promoting the oil industry, take the subsidies we give oil industry, and if you can take all those issues into account and have that conversation, which I think the safety of a pipeline, that absolutely belongs in that conversation.
So just to be clear, and then we
Yeah.
can put pipelines aside, because I
Yeah.
think I sense this coming into our conversation,
Yeah.
that you can say, well, I can look at a pipeline and say, well, yeah, okay, for the most part it does exactly what it's designed to do.
Yeah,
The real issue is what it's a part of, and that is climate change.
for one, it's a big part of First Nations isolation politically, and failure to recognize their place in Canadian society, which from a political perspective is important. They've got knowledge.
Well, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
We've dedicated a whole series of
Abs-
conversations just to land claims, and
Yeah.
where we find ourselves right now, how do we start to change that so that everybody is a fully participating member in Canadian society? And I think that this is a big issue for Canada. It's one that's going to take time to solve, but I also feel like we're starting to move in the right direction there.
Yeah, I would add to that, critical that we find a forum, because whether it's a geothermal plant, whether it's sustainable logging, all of which are forms of industry that you could see someone like me say, hey, that's clean. We need to know where we get the decisions from. And right now, I feel we are in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And, and I could stand shoulder to shoulder with any business entity, any chamber of commerce, and we could say exactly the same thing. Hey, we need to know where the decisions come from, because right now it feels like we're in a difficult patch to navigate. It will come out as we proceed, but we could do it's nailing that one down. So I'm glad you're working on that for sure.
So I did some research about a professor from Oxford University by the name of Nick Bostrom.
Right.
And he's in statistical analysis related to the humanities. And I looked him up because I started thinking, as I was preparing for you and I to have our conversation, what is it that has happened in the course of human history where we've gone from saying, I have to navigate my way around that risk because I don't even have the ability to manage anything because we didn't understand the world the way we do today. Over the last 150, 200 years, we've grown pretty good at being able to control or manage risk. But in the last little while, we started to move into a frame of mind where we're starting to say, but I want to be able to eliminate risk. What happened and why did this happen? So Bostrom's hypothesis is that we've moved into, and this is where I think climate change fits in, is we're saying, well, if we get this wrong, we're running an existential risk that when and if cataclysmic will lead to the annihilation of life as we know it.
Yeah, we're there.
Does that make sense to you?
It's absolutely, and it's one of, if there is an inconvenient truth, it's that we are pushing the boundaries of our own ability to survive on this planet, and a lot of people would say we're well beyond that, and we're currently killing the very life support system that we need to survive.
So at the core of it, that's really your concern, isn't it?
My concern is that if we don't take action soon, and if we don't avail of the opportunities like pipeline conversations to take a step back and say, what direction are we moving in? That really, I may work for an environmental organization, but my true employers, the people that really I answer to, are my nieces and my nephews. And if there's one thing that I really concerns me, it's being able to look them in the eye and say that I did the best I could to create the scenario where we could talk about their ability to live the way we've lived. And that absolutely is hanging in the balance in our generation at this time. And that is a very, I think, intimidating reality for a lot of people. It's a reality I've lived in for quite some time. And I hope that your conversations you're hosting here help people to say, well, let's just climb into this conversation now. I feel that if even economically, even if we were to look at, say, hey, look, oil exports is how Canada is going to prosper. And that is very much a line that reverberates across Canada. If you look at what the world as a society needs to do on climate change alone, it has to get off oil. And the first casualty of that is tar sands oil, or oil sands oil, if you want to be from a different perspective. What that's about is it has an added impact on the climate than any other type of oil. So it's the first to go. It will be the first to go. And I believe we are fighting as much for the Canadian economy as we are for anything else. When I hear the federal government say our prosperity lies in tar sands oil, I don't believe that. I absolutely don't believe that.
Well, where do you think it lies then?
Here. There's so many intelligent people in this country, so highly educated. The tragedy is that we have these graduates come out from universities. I met folks in UBC. I went out to speak to them about environmental issues. I met guys who stood in front of me and said, we can extract wood from our forests in a sustainable way that doesn't impact the forest survivability. That's hopeful. That's an industry. There are certain ways of generating geothermal. I'm told by that industry that we're sitting on enormous quantities of geothermal generating potential.
Well, I've spoken to geoscientists about this very topic, and they say, well, that may be true, but if you think the cost of extracting oil is high, the cost of setting up geothermal plants that are going to be able to replace energy sources that we currently need, it's a stretch. And there doesn't seem to be an appetite for it right now, both on the investment side and on the user side. So, it's an idea. It's one that, so how do we get there?
Yeah.
Like we can't just sort of go, okay, stop here, we're over there. Doesn't have to be kind of a step-by-step sort of process that allows us to gradually move from one energy source to another.
Absolutely. And that's the piece where there would be some days where I walk away from a conversation and I say, I had to give away a bit there. So I'm not in denial about the fact that the tar sands industry is large and employs a lot of people, produces a lot of oil. It's not going to disappear overnight. There is a strategy to get from where we are now to where we ought to go. And I think a lot of the impetus for the drive for this very heated pipeline conversation is federal policy on that front. We are the only nation in the world to leave the international agreement on climate change. We have what seems to be quite close to denial of the realities of climate change from an economic perspective from our government. And that really drives people to the debate, which is in a way a good thing.
Well, don't you think that the climate change discussion runs into a little bit of a roadblock every time the weather changes come mid-October in Canada,
Yeah.
and people go, but I'm cold.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll get to that. I forgot to answer your original question about
Yeah.
geothermal. The answer to that conundrum, I feel, is there's a different formula when you take in the subsidies that we hand over to the fossil fuel industry to continue us on the wrong path. Now, they come in a lot
Fair
of
enough,
shapes.
but we've
Yeah.
got infrastructure in place on
Yep.
oil and everything. We have nothing around geothermal. At the moment.
Absolutely. But let's make the shift. It's a big. We are an intelligent bunch of people, right? Like we're a mixture of folks like me, from an Irish heritage, from all sorts of different walks of life. That melting pot it's amazing. I mean, the talent we have here, we could be world leaders in this stuff, and we're sitting on a massive potential for it. That's frustrating. Like if you just look from one avenue to another avenue, suddenly all is well. It's that shift we need.
But do you feel that your efforts are starting to like nudge the needle over a little bit? Because there are people who are on the other side of this issue who are worried that you're nudging it too far. Like they're afraid of you.
Wow. Well, you know, I have far more in common with everyone on every side of this conversation than people might want to realize. And I would love to sit down with those very same folks and say, I don't want to scare you. I want to figure out how we're going to get to a place where my nieces and nephews are safe. And I'm sure any person will look at me and say, well, you know what? That's an important thing. We need to come back together. I don't want to be sitting on the opposite side of this debate for much longer. I want to be engaging in conversations about the next step.
So let's use an example here in British Columbia. The Mid-Coast Agreement that came about 12, 13 years ago was a dedicated effort by a bunch of people who said, we are not managing this resource properly. Forest companies initially were absolutely opposed to them. But ultimately they came together and came up with a formula that everybody said, okay, we can live with this. And there will be people, I'm sure that there will be people who watch this right now as I say it and say, yeah, but look at all those people who lost their jobs. Look at the transformation of that industry. It's never fully recovered. Like, I'm afraid of that. And so if I go back to Nick Bostrom's work, he talks about existential risk, which is the thing that you are the most concerned about. But he says on the other side of it is flawed realization as a risk. In the sense that we bring ourselves to a technological point and then we go, I'm afraid of the best worst case scenario, so therefore I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to bring it to maturity, and then not be able to realize what the benefit beyond that would be. And so this is the place that we find ourselves in. Can you envision a day where you say, okay, I'm not going to stand in your way around this so long as we have a conversation or there's cooperation around the way that we're going to be moving from where we are to where we need to be if we want to be a sustainable planet?
Absolutely. There's impacts with everything we do. There's going to be impacts in the solution. I've had it said, well, you know, do windmills kill birds? I don't know. But if it's a road to a better future where my nieces and nephews can survive and be at least comfortable, then so be it. Like, there are conversations that I will end up engaging in that I'll get more flack from.
You know that somebody will grab that last little soundbite that you gave from this somewhere, and they'll use that against you.
I cannot stop that.
Yeah.
What I can do is I can say, let's be real, and let's sit down and have a conversation. There are impacts about everything we do. Some impacts are not worth it. When you factor climate change into this bitumen oil pipeline debate, it changes the numbers massively. But the point I was getting to with that windmill scenario is that there will be people who, from the left side of the spectrum, we'll say politically, the heat will come not from the rights, from the pro-industry, pro-oil people. The actual challenge in the end is going to come from people who said, well, you betrayed us, and look at these impacts you're talking about. This is not acceptable whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bit where when you talk about industry getting a little bit intimidated, I'm like, wait, you see what we got coming next, because if we figure out the solution, there's always going to be detractors, always. And to summarize, there are some impacts that are worth it. There are some impacts, and that comes in the Great Bear Rainforest.
Okay, but how do we determine whether or not the risk is worth it? And I think that this is the thing.
Yeah.
You go, what makes this one worth it and that one not?
Simple math. They've estimated as best they can how much something like just one of the impacts, climate change, how much does that cost us? Now, unfortunately, due to federal policy, the body that created that, National Roundtable for the Economy and the Environment, was defunded and doesn't exist anymore. But they did get to talk about the billions and billions and billions of dollars in exposure to climate change we have here in Canada. So it's a kind of simple equation. How much does climate change cost, and how much are we creating with these pipelines? And that's where I'm coming from.
Where do we get that data, though? How do we make an informed choice about it?
It exists, and I can give you the report. Figures varied. It's quite hard to actually net down the cost of climate change, but they've done it. They've done it for BC. They did it for the whole of Canada. Multitudes of billions, 20 to 40. Eventually, it ramps up over time. That's the sum. That's the formula or equation I'm working off of. Now, if you come back and you say, okay, geothermal and wind power and solar, their impacts are, and then if we can somehow get to a monetary value of that, there are things we cannot evaluate on a monetary basis, but let's keep it simple for now. There are, in my mind, far less impactful ways of generating energy, ones we can actually do, ones we can manage the impacts of. That, if I could summarize that mentality, that's what's behind the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement, because I know for a fact that the environmental organizations involved in that have to sometimes accept some pretty eye-watering impacts.
Mm-hmm.
But they know that the overall conversation works. People are coming from the right perspective, and it came from some tough times. We're going there, I hope, with this conversation, and thank you for helping me maybe reach out to the people on either side of this debate and say, let's talk.
So if you're talking to somebody, and you're gonna, I'm sure in your experience here, you have stuck your head up above the sand, and there are people who have probably attempted to metaphorically cut it off.
Every day, yeah.
Because they're going, you're attacking my way of life. You're asking me to live differently.
Yeah.
If you could move them even just a little bit on the dial, what would that look like? And how do you think that you could give them a compelling enough reason to say, okay, Owen, you're right, I'm going to change the way that I live a little bit?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. So, well, for me, why would I take the flack? This is, it's a tough job. There's a lot of flack. I'm a pretty sensitive person, though. The people who I debate with will probably argue against that. But I am a pretty sensitive person. And I take it because my nieces and nephews are super important to me. And I think our youth are critical to all of us. I think you really want to be a pretty messed up human being to have youth either in from your own offspring or around you and not care about them. Unfortunately, there are people like that. Most people really do care. What I'd say is that, a lot of this is identity politics. A lot of people identify, this is me, and I'm pro-oil, and I'm pro-big, heavy industry, and screw you. And we got it, and then just as much I hear from my side of the debate, well, I'm a tree-loving, holistic, planet-loving type of human being, and this doesn't fit with how I see myself. We got to get over those self-identity groundings, and they
become barriers.
They're absolute barriers. But where we're all in agreement is our youth deserve a type of life that we benefited from on this planet, that it's not saving the planet, it's saving our youth and our future humanity from a very horrible existence. And if anyone doesn't get that, if anyone doesn't want to have a conversation around that, then they're probably not well.
The challenge, is especially, have you read Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist?
No.
Very interesting book. Because he basically says for the last 250, 300 years, we've had a group of people running around saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling.
Mm-hmm.
He said, but when you go back and take a look at the evidence of it, the sky hasn't fallen and everybody's life has gotten better.
Yeah.
And not by a little bit,
Yeah.
by significant amounts. He says,
Yeah.
you take the average person in 1750 versus the king, well, the average person today has a better life than the king did in 1750. And that's because of all of these advances that we've collectively made. So, you've got all of that in the background and people are going, there's a part of me that wants to support the fact that Mother Earth can only support us for so long, and yet we keep going. And so, how do you get them to make the shift? How do you get them to buy, maybe not buy a car, take public transit,
Yeah.
ride like you do, ride a bicycle,
Yeah.
and which also only happens because you're living in this world that provides the products and transportation needed to be able to deliver the bicycle to you.
Yeah.
How do you get somebody to make that shift when they're going, but I like my electric blanket, it keeps me warm at night.
Yeah.
To steal a line from my dinner with Andre.
Yeah, I'm saying electric blankets are great. Depends on, of course, the energy that funds it, right? Like if BC's got lots of hydro. So anyway, the answer to that question is, we live in a rights-based society.
Yeah.
We got to get to a responsibilities-based outlook, and we have a responsibility to our youth. And everyone can kind of get that. The other barrier, and I want people to really get over this piece real quickly, is guilt. I don't want you to feel guilty about your Hummer. I don't want you to feel guilty about your truck. I just want you to listen to me and to get beyond what you think of me and what you may think I think of you, and just hear me out, just on a very human, decent level. Because guilt is a wasted emotion. We've nothing to be guilty about.
I agree with you. The thing that I find interesting, and it comes up in my own behavior, if I'm being good, I will make right decisions, ones that will reduce my impact. Then there are times when I get tired and I take the easy way because it's there.
Yeah.
And I look at people that I know, and I know quite well, who would be like, they want to say, Owen, how can I send you some money? I believe so much in what you do. And yet they too have trouble making changes in the way they live their life on a day-to-day basis. And they go, and the excuse is, well, what difference does it make? And I think it does make a difference. You want to change, well then you better start changing yourself.
Yeah.
It's not industry's responsibility, it's our responsibility.
Yeah, I agree to it. Yeah, absolutely. So change comes from individual actions, for sure. I think
Coupled together.
I think industry's getting a free ride. I think politically, the oil and gas industry in Canada is getting a free ride, and it has a level of power over our destiny here, which is unworkable and in fact dangerous. And that I think absolutely I'll recycle and I'll ride a bike, but the responsibility doesn't all lie on my shoulders. The CEOs of the oil and gas industry that's operating in Canada, plus the federal government, have entirely dropped the ball on my niece's future and my nephew's future. And that's not fair. So as much as it is about individual actions, it is about corporate actions too, and it's about our federal government stepping up.
But do you think that they don't care about sustainability?
Are they allowed even legally to? So if you think about how a corporation operates, its structure is to make shareholder profits. It's almost the antithesis to an oil and gas industry to be responsible with climate change. And there's a huge job there for regulators, for the government. And there's a lot of talking about how climate change is a reality now for the federal government and how they care about it, same on the BC government perspective and the Alberta government perspective. But in reality, everyone can see it as just talk. There is no willingness politically to really put in for instance, a carbon tax, a figure on the ton of carbon that comes out of a certain amount of oil or gas.
But does that not get driven by individual behavior? Politicians pay attention to the people who elect them.
Yeah.
If the people who elect them don't change their behavior and don't put pressure on the politicians, then they don't change the regulatory environment. We're all in this together.
Yeah, we are, but and where you're coming from with that viewpoint is on a level playing field. And as someone who has tried to participate in the conversation in a respectful, rational way on these issues that are critical to our future, I've found that, for instance, on the media front, there is enormous amounts of bias in the media. There's an awful lot of editorial influence in the message that emerges. Money plays a huge role in what message arises or emerges and how that's framed. We are not on a level playing field, and I think there's, whether it's a strategy that was incorporated at some point or not, there's a huge amount of apathy that's almost driven by media entities here in Canada. It's tough to be in this position. Now,
So let me interrupt you for just a second. I have to come to the defense of journalism because I am a journalist by training, and I lived in that world for a long time. And I know how it works. And I can tell you that in the 10 years that I was on television doing day-to-day reporting, I never had anybody come and tell me you have to do your story this way because there is the agenda from the owners. Like not once. And I don't know many that found themselves in that environment. You can argue all sorts of things about hiring decisions. Do you hire the certain kinds of people and whatnot? But the day-to-day influence on a journalist isn't as much as you may think it is. Not even Conrad Black stuck his hand into the newsroom the way that people thought that he did. Because when it comes to that environment, what happens is a reporter runs out and looks at the world through the lens of their own experience and says, here's what I got 5 minutes to figure this out, there goes my story. So it's not somebody sitting there going, okay, let's see how we can twist the knobs and get it to come out this way.
Absolutely, and I agree.
And there are people on the other side of the debate who say, yeah, but they're paying too much attention to you and not enough to us.
I've seen the CBC being leveled with that allegation for left-sided bias.
Which isn't true either.
What you've got, though, is we're having this conversation because we both recognize that the amount of time that you have to talk about these critical issues is shrinking. It's shrinking because of the ownership structures that are there in our media world. And you're seeing massive layoffs all the time. In fact, you could say that there may not be a broadsheet like the Vancouver Sun in this part of the world for very much longer. Who knows?
I hope not.
And it's all shrinking down, and we're expecting social media to step into the breach. I would call that sort of the commons. Part of the commons, the conversation is our media outlets. They are owned by certain entities. Those entities are struggling. In that environment, they seek out some sort of funding, some sort of income that can come in the shape of advertising that someone like me couldn't afford, but the oil and gas industry can. It's not that there is a specific decision, all right, we're for big oil, but the effect of how our media is owned and operated is that it's increasingly becoming difficult to have a broad, fair conversation, even on the basis of it there being just these sound bites. Now, it's in industry's interest for there to just be sound bites so that I'm polarized and I seem like a threat. And it's not, in my opinion, in the industry's interest for me to sit down, host it with you, and have a conversation around oil and gas and see how much common ground there is. It's far easier to get your way nowadays in Canada if there is that polarization. And conversations like this kind of, I think, breach that gap.
Well, I wish you all the best as you wade deeper and deeper into this debate. I think that, like you, it's important that people be given as much information and access to information so that they can make an informed decision. And I applaud you for putting yourself out there. I'm sure it's not easy.
I mean, and I'll finish on this note because it is a very positive one, it's a very genuine one, that the challenge that climate change represents might be scary for some of us, but we will overcome this. It will better our societies. We'll be stronger and more together when we emerge. And I have no doubt about that. I think that it's sad to see the polarized conversation now, but that I'm happy to work in it. And once you take action, once you get in, it's actually an awful lot nicer. It's easier.
You remain hopeful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's too much common ground. I want a strong, prosperous, safe Canada where my youth, my offspring, which are in the planning, can experience this sort of natural resources and safety and atmosphere that I experience. I don't want them to live in a climate-affected hellhole. And I believe that the policies that we're dealing with right now send us in that direction. So if there's so much common ground, how could I not believe that this is going to get resolved?
And you believe that economically we can get through a world without the oil?
Look at our education. Like, look at our universities. Look at what we're producing in our universities. Look how smart your average graduate is. You know, to say that we're the rip it and ship it folk, right? Like, to say to someone like them, yeah, you're good for digging up oil and shipping it abroad in a raw format. That's an insult. We're too smart to not be able to figure this out and then lead the world in it because we've invested in education.
We haven't, I know that you talk about bitumen and the properties in the marine environment and so on. We didn't even talk about, well, what about Mr. Black's proposal to put in a refinery in Kitimat and transport it as a refined product? And I didn't go there because really I think that the issue from your perspective is climate change.
It is part of, yes. Now, let's be practical. There is a way for us to get to there being a tar sands that is being slowly downsized. And part of that journey is refining, I believe. Because refining in Canada does reduce the amount of boreal forest we lose to this stuff. It slows down the rampant, out of control exploitation of the resource. It could put the resource back in Canadian hands. It is out of our hands right now. We are the rip it and ship it folk. The people who own the tar sands ain't Canadians, and that's a fact. If that came with an ownership over the resource, I think it's a good step. I think refining in Alberta is a conversation that everyone, including me, should be part of. Refining on the west coast, you got to get it over all those salmon-bearing streams. It's a nightmare. Refining the tar sands, or oil sands, if you don't like tar sands, in Alberta is a conversation we all owe ourselves. Absolutely.
So you're looking for solutions.
Damn right.
Thank you very
Lovely.
much.
Nice
Thanks for
to meet you.